The frogs were the first thing I heard. Not my son, not the truck driving away, not even my own groaning. Just frogs, hundreds of them, croaking somewhere in the darkness while muddy water soaked through my clothes. For a few seconds I couldn't understand where I was. Then pain hit, sharp, brutal. My shoulder felt like it had been ripped apart. My ribs burned, and something warm was running down the side of my face. Blood, a lot of blood. I tried to sit up, big mistake. The world spun violently. I slid back into the filthy drainage ditch. That's when I remembered. My son had pushed me, not accidentally, not during an argument, deliberately. He shoved me down the embankment and watched me tumble into the ditch. Then he climbed down, reached into my jacket, took my wallet, took my phone, took my watch, and left. The last thing I heard before his truck disappeared was his voice. "Oh, you're somebody else's problem." Those words would cost him more than he could imagine, but not for the reason he thought. My name is Russell Vance. I'm 69 years old, and 7 days before my son threw me into that ditch, I had been declared dead, legally, on paper, in corporate records, in government filings. Dead the problem. Nobody bothered telling me. 3 months earlier I sold my manufacturing company, or at least that's what the newspapers reported. Founder retires after 40 years. Russell Vance steps away. New era begins. The headlines were wrong. I hadn't sold the company. I'd vanished from it. There's a difference, a very important difference. The buyer wasn't a corporation, wasn't a private equity firm, wasn't a competitor. It was a trust. A trust designed by me, built over 6 years, hidden in plain sight for one reason, protection, because I had started noticing things that bothered me. My son, Derek, loved money. Nothing unusual there. Lots of people love money. The problem was that Derek loved money more than people, more than loyalty, more than family, more than decency. And every year it got worse. At first he borrowed, then demanded, then expected. Eventually he stopped seeing me as a father. I became an obstacle standing between him and what he wanted. The breaking point came during my granddaughter's birthday party. Not because of some dramatic fight, because of a conversation he didn't know I heard. Derek was standing near the pool talking to one of his friends, drinking whiskey, lawing. The friend asked a simple question. "What happens when your dad finally retires?" Derek smirked. I'll never forget that smirk. "Retires?" He laughed. "The old man is worth more dead than retired." Everybody around him laughed, except me, because I was standing 10 feet away, listening. Something changed inside me that day. Not anger, something colder. Clarity. For the first time, I stopped asking whether my son loved me and started asking a different question. What happens if he doesn't? 6 years earlier, I would have ignored it, made excuses, defended him. Not anymore. So I started preparing, quickly, carefully, kindly. 3 months later, the trust was completed. The company disappeared from my name. The assets disappeared from my name. Everything disappeared from my name. Publicly, I looked retired, almost irrelevant. Derek celebrated. Naturally, he thought retirement meant weakness. He thought age meant vulnerability. He thought the finish line was finally visible. Then the debts started finding him. Debts he had hidden, debts he thought nobody knew about. Debts connected to gambling, luxury purchases and private loans, failed investments, bad decisions, years of bad decisions. Within months, he was drowning. Then he came to me, not as a son, as a collector. He wanted money, millions, immediately. I refused. That was 3 weeks before the ditch. The argument became ugly, then uglier, then dangerous. Eventually, Derek stood up, pointed directly at me, and said something that made the entire restaurant go silent. "If you won't help me while you're alive, I'll collect after you're gone." Every head turned. Every waiter froze. Even Derek seemed surprised he'd said it. I paid the bill, got up, walked out, and made a phone call, the most important phone call of my life. A week later, someone tried accessing accounts that no longer belonged to me. Someone forged paperwork. Someone attempted ownership transfers. Someone became very desperate. Then came the ditch. I don't remember everything, just pieces. The shove, the fall, the mud, the theft, the truck driving away, and then a flashlight, a voice, A stranger standing above me, looking shocked. "Sir, you need an ambulance." I looked up at him, cuffed mud from my mouth, and somehow managed to smile. Because while my son believed he had finally removed me from the board, he had no idea that 7 days later he would walk into company headquarters, look into the CEO office, and discover the man he threw away was waiting behind the desk. The man who found me wasn't a fisherman, wasn't a farmer, wasn't a passerby, which made the situation even stranger. He was one of my truck drivers, a 28-year employee named Calvin Reed. At 2 in the morning, he'd been hauling emergency equipment to a hospital project. A shortcut brought him past the drainage ditch. His headlights caught movement. Then he saw me. People spend years wondering who would help them during their worst moment. Sometimes the answer isn't family. Sometimes it's the people who quietly watched how you treated them. Calvin stayed with me until the ambulance arrived, refused to leave, refused interviews, refused attention. When doctors asked who he was, he simply said, "He's my boss." That sentence hit harder than the fall, because my own son hadn't acted like one. The hospital wanted me resting, the police wanted statements, the insurance company wanted reports. I wanted information. Specifically, I wanted to know what Derek was doing. The answer arrived quickly, far too quickly. 48 hours after the attack, my son was already acting like I'd disappeared permanently. He wasn't searching for me, wasn't filing missing person reports, wasn't calling hospitals, wasn't calling friends. Instead, he was contacting lawyers, bankers, corporate officers, investors, interesting priorities. The police investigation also produced something fascinating. My wallet appeared, discarded beside a highway, credit cards gone, cash gone, identification gone. Only one thing remained, a photograph of Derek at 10 years old, standing beside me after catching his first fish. The officer who handed it over asked if I wanted to keep it. I stared at the picture for a long moment, then nodded. Because memories aren't responsible for what people become. People are. On day 4, I finally left the hospital, quickly, no announcements, no reporters, no public appearance. Instead, I went somewhere nobody expected. The headquarters of Vance Industrial Holdings, not the old company, the new one, the real one. The company the newspapers didn't know existed. The company Derek didn't know existed. The company hidden behind the trust. 6 years earlier, when I started losing faith in my son's judgment, I began moving key divisions into a separate structure. Not because I planned revenge, because I planned survival. Factories, patents, supply contracts, international partnerships, technology licenses, the most valuable pieces, legally, properly, quickly. By the time Derek believed he was inheriting an empire, most of the empire had already moved, not stolen, not hidden illegally, simply relocated into an organization he never bothered understanding. Because Derek only looked at headlines, never documents. The headquarters occupied the top 20 floors of a glass tower downtown. No company name outside. No public profile, no press releases. Exactly how I preferred it. The board was already waiting when I arrived. 12 people. Most had known me for decades. A few looked angry, several looked relieved. One looked ready to kill somebody. The chairman spoke first. "We heard what happened." I nodded. Then another director slid a folder across the table. Inside were documents, emails, recorded calls, financial requests, forged authorizations, everything Derek had attempted since my disappearance. Apparently my son hadn't just taken my wallet, he'd launched a full-scale raid. He tried accessing accounts, tried claiming authority, tried pressuring lenders, tried intimidating managers, tried convincing people he was now in charge. The problem? None of those people worked for him. Most worked for me, or more accurately, for the trust, and unlike Derek, they actually read contracts. The board's general counsel leaned forward. "Russell." His voice was calm, generously calm. "We need to discuss whether your son committed fraud." The room became silent. Fraud, assault, theft, identity misuse, attempted unauthorized transfers. The list was growing. Then the chairman asked the question nobody wanted to ask. What exactly do you want us to do? Interesting question. Because until that moment, I hadn't thought about revenge. Not really. I thought about survival, protection, consequences, but not revenge. Then I remembered the ditch, the mud, the wallet, the truck driving away, and suddenly I realized something. If I simply destroyed Derek financially, he'd learn nothing. If I sent lawyers after him, he'd blame everyone except himself. If I rescued him again, he'd become worse. No. For the first time in his life, my son needed something far more painful than punishment. He needed the truth, and 7 days after throwing me into that ditch, I intended to deliver it personally. Because on Monday morning, Derek was scheduled to attend what he believed was the most important business meeting of his life. He expected to walk into that tower and take control. Instead, he was going to open the CEO office door and discover exactly who he'd tried to bury. Monday morning arrived with sunshine. Funny how the world stays beautiful on the days your life falls apart. At 8:47 a.m., Derek stepped out of a black SUV in front of the tower, confident, smiling, wearing a custom-made suit he couldn't actually afford. He believed this was his coronation, the beginning of his empire, the reward he'd been chasing for years. What he didn't know was that half the people inside the building were already aware of what he'd done. The theft, the forged documents, the fake authority, the desperate attempts to seize control. Nobody warned him. Sometimes reality is more effective when it introduces itself. The elevator carried him to the 48th floor, executive level. Restricted access. Normally, visitors needed authorization, but that morning I instructed security to let him through. Every door, every checkpoint, every gate. I wanted him to reach the office. The board members were already seated when he arrived. 12 directors, 3 attorneys, 2 auditors, the general counsel, the chairman, and me, sitting behind the CEO desk, waiting. The moment Derek walked in, his face went white, not pale white, like every drop of blood had abandoned him. For 3 full seconds, nobody spoke. Then he laughed, a nervous laugh, the kind people make when their brains reject reality. What the hell is this? I leaned back in the chair, the same chair he believed belonged to him. Good morning, Derek. The room remained silent. Derek looked around, reaching for answers, reaching for allies, reaching for somebody to tell him this was a joke. Nobody helped him. Then he finally spoke. You're supposed to be in a hospital. Interesting choice of words. Not are you okay? Not I thought you were dead. Not Dad. Just disappointment that I wasn't where he wanted me. The chairman folded his hands. Please take a seat. Derek didn't move. His confidence was already leaking away. Then the attorneys began distributing folders, one to every person at the table, including him. Inside were photographs, the ditch, the ambulance, my injuries, hospital reports, security footage, bank records, forgery attempts, pawnheng records, everything. The smile vanished completely. By the 3rd page, his hands were shaking. By the 5th page, he stopped turning pages. By the 10th, he looked sick. Then came the audio recording, the restaurant conversation, the one he'd forgotten about. The old man is worth more dead than retired. His own voice echoed through the boardroom, crystal clear. Nobody interrupted. Nobody commented. Nobody reacted, which somehow made it worse. When the recording ended, the room became silent again. Finally, Derek looked toward me. Dad. First time he'd called me that in months. Too late, much too late. The chairman stood. Then something happened Derek never expected. The chairman didn't discuss ownership, didn't discuss money, didn't discuss leadership. Instead, he projected a giant chart onto the wall. A chart showing company performance, client retention, company loyalty, profitability, growth, reputation, 40 years of data. Then another chart appeared, the period after Derek began interfering. Every line pointed downward, every single one. Millions lost, contracts lost, employees lost, relationships lost, trust lost. The chairman looked directly at him. Do you know what the most valuable asset in this company is? Derek didn't answer. It's not factories. Another pause. It's not patents. Another. It's not money. The chairman pointed toward me. It's trust. The room remained perfectly still. Then came the final blow. Not from me. not from the board, from someone Derek never expected. The conference room door opened, and Calvin Reed walked inside, the truck driver who found me in the ditch. Derek frowned, confused. Calvin calmly took a seat. Then the chairman smiled. "Derek, meet the man who saved your father's life." The color disappeared from Derek's face because suddenly, for the first time, the ditch stopped being a story, stopped being an inconvenience, stopped being a problem. It became real, and Calvin wasn't finished speaking, not even close. Calvin Reed wasn't supposed to matter. That was Derek's mistake. He spent his entire life judging people by titles, by offices, by salaries, by status. He never understood that sometimes the most important person in the room isn't the richest, it's the person who knows the truth. Calvin sat down quietly, no expensive suit, no executive title, no fancy presentation, just a truck driver with 30 years of loyalty. The chairman nodded toward him. "Tell us what you found." Calvin looked directly at Derek, not angry, disappointed, much worse. "I found your father face down in mud." The room went silent. He was unconscious. Another silence. There was blood on his face. Derek couldn't look at him anymore. Calvin continued, "I called emergency services. I stayed until the ambulance arrived." Then he reached into his jacket and removed something small. A wallet, my wallet, the one police had recovered. The chairman looked confused. "So?" Calvin opened it, removed the photograph of 10-year-old Derek standing beside me. Then he placed it on the table. "You know what bothered me?" Nobody answered. This picture was still inside. The room stayed silent. He took the money. Calvin looked directly at Derek. He took the cards. Another pause, but he left the picture. Nobody understood where he was going until he finished, because somewhere deep down, he knew exactly whose wallet he was stealing. The words hit harder than any accusation. Even the attorneys looked uncomfortable. Then the chairman stood. "Let's move forward." The lights dimmed. A presentation appeared. Not about finances, not about ownership, not about contracts, about succession. Interesting. Very interesting. Because Derek had spent years assuming this meeting was about inheriting power. It wasn't. The chairman clicked the remote. The first slide showed executive evaluations. The second showed leadership assessments. The third showed succession candidates. Dozens of names. Managers, directors, division heads, regional leaders. Then one final slide appeared. "Sasko recommendation." Derek leaned forward, expecting his name. It wasn't there. Never had been. The room became completely silent because for the first time, my son realized something horrifying. There was never a throne waiting for him. The company had evaluated him years earlier, and determined he wasn't qualified, not because he lacked intelligence, not because he lacked education, because he lacked character. The board had documented it, repeatedly. Entitlement, poor judgment, impulsive decisions, weak leadership, financial recklessness, lack of accountability, years of observations, years. Derek stared at the screen, unable to speak. Then he looked at me. "When did you know?" I answered honestly, 8 years ago. The words landed like a bomb, because he expected betrayal. What he got was truth. I hoped I was wrong. Silence, so I gave you opportunities. Another silence. I gave you mentors. Another. I gave you responsibility. Another, and every time I looked directly at him, you chose shortcuts. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then I stood up slowly. The entire room watched. "Derek." His eyes met mine. "For years you thought this company was your inheritance." I shook my head. It never was. The room became so quiet you could hear the air conditioning. "This company belongs to the people who earned it." I pointed toward Calvin, people like him. Toward the directors, people like them. Toward the executives, the people who built it. Then finally toward myself, and the people who protected it. Derek lowered his head, because for the first time in his life, nobody was rescuing him. Nobody was making excuses for him. Nobody was rewriting reality. The chairman cleared his throat, then delivered the final decision. All ownership claims denied, all authority revoked, all pending transfers cancelled. Permanent removal from every leadership pathway. Finished. Just like that. The empire he'd spent years chasing disappeared. Not because I took it away, because he never had it. 3 years later, the company was larger than ever, stronger than ever. Calvin became director of logistics, then vice president, then a board advisor. Not because he saved my life, because he earned every promotion. As for Derek, he eventually found work, not glamorous work, real work. For the first time in his life, we speak occasionally now, carefully, slowly. Some relationships survive betrayal, but they never return to what they were. People often ask me if seeing him lose everything felt satisfying. The answer surprises them. No. Watching your child destroy himself is never satisfying. What satisfied me was something else. The day he finally stopped blaming everyone around him. The day he looked me in the eye and said, "Dad, I threw away more than a wallet." And for the first time, he understood exactly what he'd lost.